Today, from the Abyssinian Missionary Baptist Church with Dr. Eugene W.
From
Diamond.
your past, which is now hindering you from running in your present. But I came to tell you, it's time you let it go. Some of you packed up your baggages in some nice Gucci and Louis Vuitton bags, but it's still baggage. And if you're going to run this race, you've got to be willing to let it go. Come with me, if you would, now to the book of Hebrews, chapter 12. And I just want the first two verses, Hebrews chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. I'm going to deviate from the King James Version, and I draw your attention to the New International Version, the NIV, starting with verse 1 and concluding at verse 2. The 12th chapter of the book of Hebrews, the word of the Lord says, "Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles. And let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us. And let us fix our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God." You may be seated in the presence of our God. Verse 1 again says, "Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles, and let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us." For a few moments, I want to talk to you from this thought: a strategy for running in the new year. A strategy for running in the new year. My brothers and sisters, as we stand at the beginning of a brand new year, the pressure to start off on the right foot is at its greatest. As a matter of fact, most of us have already integrated changes into our daily and weekly routines. In his book entitled The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, author Stephen Covey's second habit says, "Begin with the end in mind." And that's actually one of the driving forces fueling the commitment that we have to change. It's the thought of where we want to be and who we want to become by year's end that motivates us to work harder, stretch further, eat better, read more, and even start serving God this year. It actually means, y'all, running life's race with a clear view of the finish line. It's with this thought that we come to our text this morning, with the writer of Hebrews informing his readers that the Bible's greatest faith champions, who were listed in chapter 11, are now seated in the grandstand of heaven watching us run life's race. The thought that most of God's greatest champions had to overcome hurdles and setbacks to finish their life's race is proof positive that every runner can finish their race if only they just keep running. So for this year, The challenge for every church member is to become more effective in running life's race. In order for every church member to be more effective this year in our Christian race, the Hebrew writer states that there are some things we must do. First, we must remove every encumbrance. In verse 1b, the text says, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles us. The author is clear in telling us that if we are going to run, we must be willing to strip off some stuff. My brother from another mother, Pastor Jackson, ran his first half marathon last year after training for almost 2 years. One of the things he told me is that when he started the race, it was early in the morning before the sun came up, and it was quite cold even for South Florida weather. So the runners were dressed, y'all, catch this, in layers of clothes when they started the race. However, as they were running, the sun came up and the temperature rose until it became hot. So while the runners were running or jogging, they stripped off all of the outer layers of clothes, so much so until Pastor Jackson said that the road was literally covered with clothes, so much so that you had to be careful where you were stepping. So I asked him, when do the runners go back and get their clothes? To which he replied, never. He said there is an unwritten rule that runners never go back to pick up things that they have thrown off. You missed your shout. The things in which we stripped off, we are never to go back and pick up again. So no matter how valuable you thought they were or how much fun you thought they brought you, we are to leave them all behind. That's why Paul says in Philippians 3:13, but this one thing I do, forgetting those things which are behind me and reaching forth to those things which are before. The Hebrew writer states that the success of the runner, y'all, is based on his or her ability to strip off and stay clear. Let the church shout, strip off. The text says that as runners, we must throw off everything that hinders or weighs us down. No runner can run effectively with stuff weighing him or her down. Trying to run, y'all, with bags or luggage is next to impossible. That means if we're going to be effective running this Christian race this year, we must let go of the baggage we have been carrying in years past. Baggage like past mistakes and unforgiveness. We must all let them go in order to run this race. The 20-pound list of those who've hurt you, wronged you, mistreated you, or abused you, you must let go of so you can better run your race. I know a lot of you have slept with and held on to some of the things from your past, which is now hindering you from running in your present. But I came to tell you, it's time you let it go. Some of you packed up your baggages in some nice Gucci and Louis Vuitton bags, but it's still baggage. And if you're going to run this race, you've got to be willing to let it go. Touch your neighbor, say, let it go. Yeah, in order to run more effectively, not only are there some things we must strip off, but also there are some sins that we must stay clear of. The writer warns the runners that in this race there are some sins that so easily entangle us. Like the mounds of clothes and other obstacles that are on the road, runners must stay vigilant to keep from running or getting entangled or tripping what lies ahead. As a runner, we must avoid those sins that so easily entangle us. One of the most important things that runners do before running an actual marathon is to run the course of the marathon beforehand. This is so the runner will be familiar with the obstacles on the course, so that when the actual running of the race takes place, they know where and how to avoid certain obstacles that would hinder them. There are some sins, y'all, that have tripped us up in our past that we now ought to know how to avoid. Some things that have entangled us last year shouldn't turn around and entangle us this year. There are some sins that we've gotten out of last year that shouldn't be an entanglement for us maybe it's just me, this year. There are some folk who we were running with last year that actually caused us to go off course. However, there's a lesson I've learned, y'all, from watching the horse races. Don't ask when, don't ask where. That every horse in a race has on what's called a set of blinders that keeps the horse from seeing those who are next to him or behind him. I've just told you something. This is done to keep the horse from being distracted or led astray by what's going on around him. Dare I say that there are certain people we call friends that we need to have blinders with to keep them from causing us to stray off course. There are some folk that you just need to stop paying attention to because literally they aren't headed where God's calling you and they aren't doing what God's calling you to do. And so before you get tied up, boo-boo, with the wrong nut, you ought to put some blinders on so you can stay in your lane. The Bible shows us that most sins, y'all, start with a look, which then turns into a lust, which then leads us to sin, and that eventually leads us to death. James says it this way, but every man is tempted when he's drawn away of his own lust and entice. Then when lust have conceived, it bring forth sin, and sin, when it's finished, finally will bring forth death. It's upon us to guard our eyes so that while we are running, we are not drawn off course by others. In order for every church member to be more effective this year in our Christian race, not only must we remove every encumbrance, but secondly, the Hebrew writer says that we must run with all endurance. In verse 1c, the text says, and let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us. The King James says, and let us run with patience. Here, the Hebrew writer, y'all, talks about two things, the race and the route. Let the church say the race. We've all heard the saying that the race is not given to the swift nor to the strong, but to those who endure till the end. This Christian race, y'all, that we are running is not a sprint, but rather a marathon, which means that we can't just hit it and quit it. As we step up this year to be more than a church member, we must remember that the Apostle Paul says in Galatians 6 and 9 that we must not be weary in well-doing. For in due season we shall reap if we faint not. As runners, we are instructed to run with patience. The word patience or perseverance here in the Greek is hupomone, which means literally to remain under. The thought behind it means for the runner to run while under the weight and strain of the race, which means that even when we feel run down and burned out, we must endure it to keep on running. I just said something. For every saint that has figured that you're burnt out, for every believer that's been working and now you're ready to throw in the towel, you are encouraged to endure it and keep on running. For those runners who've been running for a while and now find themselves on the sideline because they have finished a few laps, it should be noted that the race is still, y'all, far from being over. You got to run the entire race. So tell your neighbor, don't quit, keep running. Not only is there the race, but also there is the route. Let the church say route. The text says that we are to run with patience the race marked out for us. This means that though we are all running this Christian race as believers, we are not all running the same course. Every believer has his or her own course to run. And I got news for you. Some courses are longer. Some courses are steeper. And some courses go through more valleys than others. And before you start complaining about the course, you ought to understand God has a reason why some courses are different from others. Before you complain with how long or how steep or how many valleys there are in your course, you ought to pump your brakes, baby, and just be thankful to God that you got a course. Come here, let me help you. Watch this, because if your course is longer, that means that God will grant you the extra years it takes to finish it. I just said goodbye to a deacon shepherd whose course took him 98 years to finish. And you ought to be glad that God will extend your time. If your course is steeper, that means that God will give you the strength to climb it. And so before you complain, you ought to thank God that he continues to strengthen you to handle your course. And if your course has more value than other folks' courses, then that means that God has put more mountaintops on your journey. You miss your shout, because every valley comes with two mountains, and if you got more valleys, that means you got more mountains, and God is giving you some mountaintop experiences. So please, keep your blinders on so you don't get distracted by somebody else's course. The Apostle Paul told Timothy at the end of his race, I have fought a good fight. I have finished my course, and I have kept the faith. Every one of us got a course to finish. Every one of us got a race to complete, and you ought to be into finishing your course. Go ahead and encourage your neighbor and tell them, finish your course. In order for every church member to be more effective this year in our Christian race, not only must we remove every encumbrance and run with all endurance, but finally the Hebrew writer says that we must also refocus on our assurance. Please don't miss this. In verse 2, the text says, let us fix our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, who in running this race, the Hebrew writer gives us the best piece of advice he could ever give to a runner. And that is to focus on Jesus, because he's the author and finisher or perfecter of our faith. When I'm in the gym, y'all, running on the elliptical, I've discovered that the worst thing I can do while I'm running is focus on the time, distance, and calorie counter on the display. Nothing makes me want to quit and give up more than seeing how long it takes for me to make significant progress. I declare the longer I look at it, the slower the numbers move, the more tired I get. And doggone it, it seemed like I've been on here for 10 minutes and I ain't even made a half a mile yet. And so it becomes discouraging. Watch this. When it seems like we aren't making significant progress, there is this desire to make us want to give up and quit. But I came to tell you, you're focusing on the wrong thing. I've discovered that only means we need to change our focus and look at where our help comes from. When you think about giving up, when you think about throwing in the towel, David said, just wait before you give up. Wait for your hope. That's why it says in Psalm 27 and 14, wait on the Lord and be of good courage, and he shall strengthen thine heart. Wait, I say, on the Lord. Isaiah echoes what David said, and Isaiah wanted you to know that before you throw in the towel, before you give up, Isaiah said, but they that wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings as of eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. And so I thought I'd tell you, if it doesn't look like you made much progress last year or the year before that or the year before that, and you feel like throwing in the towel, don't throw it in. Just wait on the Lord. Change your focus, baby, and put your eyes on Jesus, because he will give you the strength to go on and finish. Well, that's all I got for you. But the best way I thought about this thing is that I remembered in 1988, the Summer Olympics were held in Los Angeles, California. They held the track and field events in the Coliseum. Well, I watched as the Olympic runners ran the marathon, 26 point some miles. They started in the Coliseum. They had to run a few laps around the track in the Coliseum, and then they left out of the Coliseum. It was the first event of the day, and once they cleared the Coliseum, they then went on to other events, and by the end of the day, there was a racers coming in, and they came into the Coliseum finishing the marathon. But when they got in the Coliseum, they had one more lap to do, and they ran the lap. They pulled the cord. They finished first, second, and third, gold, silver, and bronze. And then the rest of the racers finished, and then they went back to the rest of the track and field events. And after the late evening, they were finishing up with the long jump. And when they finished, every reporter started giving their summations on the day's events. But then word came that, hold on, there's still a runner that's still outside. He's still running. People looked at their watches. The sun was setting. They had been turned the clock off. And somebody said there's still one out there. Cameras were being unpacked. They showed him from the helicopter. He was limping down the street, headed toward the stadium. When he got closer, he had a bandage around his head. He had his leg wrapped up, and he was limping, doing the best he can. The ambulance was behind him. They were still telling him, you ought to quit now. You ought to give up. They've turned off the clock. But he refused to stop running. When he got in the stadium, folks started clapping. They would think that he would have quit, but he knew he still had one more lap. He limped around the track. They went and found the cord. They let him break the rope. And when he stopped, every microphone, every camera ran in his face. They had one question to ask him: why in the world? Since you got injured, since you were badly wounded, why didn't you give up? We would have understood. But what made you stay in the race? That's when the African responded. He said, I'm from a poor country. He said, and my folk had to sacrifice just to get me here. He said, now they didn't send me here, not necessarily to win the race. He said, but they did send me to finish the race. And so because of their sacrifice, that's what wouldn't let me stop. Well, I'm reminded on a hill called Calvary of a greater sacrifice. And the reason that I don't stop is because one Friday they stretched him wide. One Friday they hung him high. He died one Friday, but early Sunday morning he got up. That's the sacrifice. So when I want to quit, I remember what Jesus did for me. That's why I run. That's why I celebrate, because of his sacrifice. So I'm still in the race. I've fallen a few times, but I got back up. I came to tell you that in this race you will fall. The proverbial writer says that a righteous man falls 7 times. But what makes him righteous is that he doesn't stay down. You get back up. You might have to limp a little bit. But keep on running. There's some other folk who fall out the race, but you keep on running. When folk want to know why you do what you do, you tell them, I remember the sacrifice, because he did for me what I couldn't do for myself. That's why I've determined to be more than just a church member. He's done way too much for me to give up now. So it's a new year. And I shout because I got a new opportunity to run a little faster, run a little further for the Lord.
Thank you for watching our on-demand service at the Abyssinia Missionary Baptist Church. If you want this sermon in its entirety, then click on the app store below. You'll be directed to our website, and you can place your order there for this sermon or other sermons we have available. If you're in the Jacksonville area, we'd love for you to come and visit us. We're located at 10325 Interstate Center Drive, just off of I-95 and Dunn Avenue. Our worship times are as follows. Our early morning worship on Sunday begins at 7:30. Our Sunday school begins at 9 o'clock, and our mid-morning worship begins at 10:15. Also, you can join us on Wednesdays for our midweek Bible study beginning at 6:30 p.m. Thank you again for tuning in and visiting our website. God bless.